Hey everyone. Thank you for joining us here at Talent Acquisition Trends and Strategy. I'm your host, James Mackey. Really excited for today's conversation. We're joined with Jessa Messina. Jessa, thank you for joining us today. This is going to be a fun conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. I was so excited when we met to hear about your podcast and to be a part of this. So really happy to be here today.
Yeah, I am. I'm pumped. So just we're going to be talking about psychological safety, the importance of it, what it means holistically, and how companies can make it a priority within the organization. We have some really interesting stats on the ROI of psychological safety. So I'm really excited to dive into that with you. Before we get into it, though, would you mind sharing a little bit about your background and your company and what you all are doing right now?
Absolutely. So my company is called Yojo, and we bring corporate wellness to companies now all over the world because most of the services are digital. I started Yojo almost 10 years ago, and it has pivoted with the future of work and how work is evolving. And now I have a portal with online content as well as live workshops, and all the content's curated towards burnout management, diversity, equity, and inclusion, leadership training, and ergonomic support.
Okay, really cool. And what type of companies do you typically work with?
You know, the funny part of that is that it is much broader than I would have thought that it would be. Everything from law firms to tech startups to retail companies, agencies, you name it. So many companies, I think, now understand that their culture is one of the most important connections to their profit margin and their retention. So it's starting to be everywhere.
Yeah, no, that's really cool to see. And I agree. We are seeing a pretty massive shift. And I think people are starting to get it. I don't think a lot of people, I think a lot of it's like culturally driven and driven on a lot of the topics that we're seeing out there in the news. And we're seeing a shift, if you will, across the country. But I think that there's a lack of understanding on the true ROI for a lot of folks, not all of them, but they don't truly understand the impact that it's going to have on the business. I think it's for a lot of people becoming a bigger value, right, or more important value, and so we're seeing that value shift, but there's still, I think, a bit of a gap in terms of people's understanding of the ROI. So I want to, if we could start there, like, what do you, when you're going to companies and you've obviously found alignment on from a value perspective why it's so important, what do you share with them in terms of this is why from a business perspective and an ROI perspective it's so important to make this a priority?
Well, from the business perspective, there was a great study that Accenture did. Psychological safety, when this is not just a value that's spoken, but a value that's really embedded in a culture, you will see 27% reduction in turnover, 50% more productivity, 76% more engagement, and 74% less stress. That's just for the business. But psychological safety is probably also one of the greatest determinants of someone's physical, mental, and emotional health. So this is a win-win for the company and the employee.
Yeah, it sounds like it, and that's a really interesting study, and I think those are obviously very significant numbers. It's not like, okay, there's going to be a 3% reduction in turnover, right? 50% more productivity, more engagement. That's huge. So I mean, that's really interesting, and so I think too, it's like most people have. Well, maybe not, but at least in tech, a lot of people have heard the term psychological safety, but I think only they probably understand it at a surface level. So could you help define psychological safety maybe in a little bit more detail?
Yeah,
Because I think a lot of people don't actually know the full meaning of the term.
absolutely. And I want to start to say that the more these terms become buzzwords, oftentimes the more confusing they are.
I agree.
To
I agree
my
with that.
shock, gaslighting was the word of the year in 2022. Right? Like everybody is using this psychological jargon, and I'm impressed. I love it, but I also think the buzzword starts to water it down, right? Like we're hearing it everywhere. But we're sort of scratching our head for what like the shared semantic is.
Right. And that's actually like, we're seeing that a lot. I see that a lot with like culture, just using culture, like culture is important. And it's honestly, it's even at like a C level, CPO level, where like they'll, people will want to share their philosophy and culture, but it's pretty surface level. And you don't necessarily always get a lot of substance in terms of how to integrate that throughout the company or the true ROI of that either. So I agree. It's that, and I post about this sometimes on LinkedIn. It's like, yes, culture is very important, but if when it's just used as a buzzword or when it's used as something that's it's a popular topic, but we're not actually diving into tactics and how to implement it and why it's important from a business perspective, it's a missed opportunity.
I couldn't agree more. And now I've been following you on LinkedIn, so I feel like I have more insight because I've been reading your posts and really seeing the alignment that we have in sort of those views on just really diving into what a healthy culture looks like and getting into the nitty gritty so you can have action steps. So for psychological safety, the way that I would really define it is an environment that does not trigger a stress response, and a stress response being something that sends your nervous system into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Those are the states that we go into when our nervous system no longer feels safe. And when we are responding from any of those four responses, what happens is our nervous system is dysregulated and it will start to send stress hormones through our body like cortisol and adrenaline. Psychological safety is an environment where the nervous system can operate without going into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And this allows us to use more of the frontal lobe of our brain, which actually allows us to be calm, collected, creative, and have easier time connecting with others.
Yeah,
I know there's a lot there, so let me know if there's anything you want me to break down.
Yeah, for sure. There's a lot to unpack there. So I'm just trying to like relate from my own experience. The one that really stuck out to me was creativity because, in my role, like running a company, it's obviously very stressful. I don't think there's any way to get around that. Like, it's just, there's always a million things to do.
Right.
And one thing that I've noticed over the years is that you need a very strong work ethic to run a company, but you also have to have the discipline to sometimes step away, because when you step away from all the madness and all the fires, it's actually when you can do your creative thinking, and that when you can come back with the energy to have different solutions to the same problem. So I've definitely noticed that from like a creativity standpoint, that actually makes a pretty big difference, at least like from my own experience.
Oh, 100%. And I'll give some examples to paint the picture because you gave a wonderful example. So we can feel psychologically unsafe when our nervous system feels like we have to work until the point of exhaustion, or we might lose our job, we might not be seen as valuable. So when our body thinks it can't rest, we will be triggered and not feel psychologically safe. When we feel emotionally, how can I say, when we feel a sense of fear or negative emotions around leadership, we feel psychologically unsafe. So if there's a manager and your heart stops every time they send a Slack, that's not a psychologically safe environment. We can feel unsafe, especially in the sea of layoffs, if it isn't communicated why the layoffs are happening, when and how. So all of that, where we fear, am I going to have a job tomorrow? All of those things are examples of things that could make a person go into a stress response.
Well, so that actually was going to be my follow-up question, is how can companies create an environment of psychological safety when it's a down market and a spiral of layoffs, right? So, I mean, that seems like an impossible task, quite honestly. I mean, so there's things we can do to make it better, but can we truly eliminate that stress? Probably not, right?
I love that you asked, because I think that there are still so much that in this moment, this is an opportunity to create a new model. And this is an opportunity. And I actually feel extremely optimistic that there's so much we can do. I have a client actually who I am just taken aback and extremely impressed by the way they had to do 15% RIF. And what they did was, it was the way they communicated, it was the honesty, it was the transparency, and it was the support that they gave people. So what they did was they sent a message before, hey, we are going to be doing these layoffs. Just so you know, if you do get that message, a lot of support will be given. They actually did not cut their emails off for a week. They used the next several days to lead workshops and help them find new jobs. And the majority of the people that were laid off by the week following the layoffs either had interviews or they already even had a new job because the company supported them. So what I would say is give the loyalty to your employee that you expect them to give to you. If you don't expect any from them, that's okay, but just be really transparent about the culture. And I think we should all veer away from ever using the term "we're family" here. To me, that's an ultimate red flag. First of all, a lot of people might have really toxic families. So that's the last thing that they want. Second of all, you don't fire your family in most situations. So what you might say is, we are a community. We are, be honest about the extent to which you give and make sure that that extent that you are giving is never more than what you're asking for from your employees.
Sure. So I find the term family pretty manipulative. And I think honestly, I think a lot of leaders know that. And I think that I mean, straight up, like maybe there are some manager and director level folks that use the term family from a genuine perspective. It's still wrong. They might genuinely believe it. They are wrong every time.
Yeah.
But like seriously, like it's just not logical. But I think at an executive level, if that's the message being sent down, it's the wrong message. And honestly, if you're running a company like that, it's not going to be successful in the long run. It's a lot more likely to go out of business. So the way that we actually structure it is, look, this is a high performing team. Like and you earn your spot on this team. And we go through culture and we go through a lot of different aspects of how we operate as a team. But I think it's important to have that distinction where, this is a organization that is here to produce certain outcomes, and let's be transparent about that. And let's be also transparent about what outcomes you need to produce and what your career track looks like and how you can progress and what you're going to learn and get out of this relationship. So I think it all comes down to setting very clear expectations. And I think as long as you do that, like people are honestly a lot happier because they know exactly where they stand. Like, this is what's expected of me. I know that there's going to be an honest a feedback loop to share with me how I'm doing. And this is the way that I can continue to progress in my career. And also communicating the values of the company, right? So it's not all just cut and dry in terms of performance. But again, I think people, in terms of psychological safety, when you know what's expected of you and it's a very clear measurement of success, and you feel like it's obtainable and you have the support and whatnot to get to there, I think people would much prefer that environment to an environment like, hey, it's family, and oh, by the way, like we're cutting. It's better to just be transparent and own the fact that there are certain outcomes that have to be produced, and we have to work together as a team to figure out the best way to produce those outcomes, right?
I agree with everything that you said about managing expectations, being direct in communication. And to that, the other thing I would say is not just the support for the people that did get let go. I've seen some companies try to hide the fact that they're doing layoffs and not supporting the people on LinkedIn who then are just promoting themselves to get more visibility, to get a job, but supporting the people that were laid off. And on top of that, also understanding the impact of the people that are still there. So if employees are still there, one of my friends, we were at a company together and I connected with her after that company had done layoffs. And I was like, how are you doing? And she said, I feel like I'm in a war zone where there were a lot of casualties and I'm left alive, but I have PTSD. And while that might feel like an exaggeration, know that a lot of people on the team, one, they feel really uneasy. But two, on top of the emotional disruption it caused, they really don't know what their job description is because likely you're doing a reorg after a RIF. And so I think at any given day, a great manager is able to have a clear job description for their employee. Remember that you don't own someone's time. You don't own a person. So if they are your employee, it doesn't mean that they are available to you at any moment in time. What it means is that they have a job description and they are fulfilling that job description, and in turn, they are receiving a salary. And that's a reciprocal exchange. They should be able to do whatever the job description is, and and then they can receive that payment. But the flip side is that what companies often do, and where the boundaries get really murky, is there isn't the time to say, hey, these are your top 5 parts of your job description. This is what is most important, and this is what the exchange looks like. So anytime a company does a pivot, a riff, make sure you sit down with your employees and have that clarity on what the exchange is. It reminds me of Friends. There's an episode, and maybe this is dating myself for like Gen Z that is watching this. But hopefully I think there's going to be like a good millennial Gen X audience that will know this. Ross and Rachel, like there was that moment where he was like, I thought we were on a break. And the point was, there was a lack of understanding of, are we in a committed relationship still where we are only with each other, or are we not? So the employees and the managers neither should ever have a moment where they go, I thought we were on a break. Everyone should know what is expected and have a conversation when expectations change.
Yeah, you're right. And I think sometimes companies might feel like they're moving way too fast, or I think people tend to make assumptions, right? And I think it's maybe at first not that noticeable, but there continues to be a bigger separation in terms of what people might have in terms of expectations where it's not aligned. And so it might start as very small things, but over a period of 3 to 6 months or a year, it can really start to impact an organization. So yeah, I think it's very important for there to be a clearly defined outcomes that people are expected to reach, and that it needs to go up to a management level too. I mean, everybody at every stage of the organization should have clearly defined success metrics, and I think that a lot of the times that gets blurred. The other thing I'll say is that I don't think roles should be opened like without clear performance expectations outlined. So before you even start recruiting for a role, I feel like one of the requirements to open a new position at the company should be, what does success look like? How are we actually measuring success? And that's not something that's typically like that. Usually is, kind of figure it out as we go. But I think the most effective talent acquisition orgs should require that from hiring managers and the executive team before the role's even opened.
I completely agree. And another, besides the family thing, another trigger that I want to point out that I think for anyone who's watching that is a job seeker, if you are in an interview and they say this, I highly encourage you to run away. If a company advertises themselves as a rocket ship, I want to stay on planet Earth. You know what I'm saying? I'm not trying to go to outer space right now. I don't want to get on a rocket ship, because what a rocket ship tells me, or when I hear a CRO say, I brought a company from 0 to 70 million in a year or something like that, what I hear is, I went so fast that I missed a lot of the important pieces. I burned people out along the way, and I was not able to act with care. In fact, all I cared about was an end goal more than human beings. There are very, very, very few circumstances where a rocket ship doesn't have many casualties, including like severe health consequences for the people aboard. So I actually interviewed at a company, and someone said that, and it was really interesting. It was one of the worst interviews of my life. The interviewer actually got up and didn't prepare for the interview, got up in the middle of the interview to answer someone else's questions, and then asked me the same questions that the recruiter previous had asked. The hiring manager asked me the same questions. So there was no continuity. Again, no insult to them. Also, for anyone listening to this, I'm not looking for a job, just to make sure. But what I love so much about the example, and what almost makes me want to like take an interview just to see sometimes, is the way we care for people from the very beginning. The second someone's interacting with your brand, they're interacting with, how do you care for your business and humans?
Right.
And to me, that was an example of pure recklessness, and a lack of care that would be effective.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. So category leading companies that are exploding with growth typically are not successful at putting people first. Even if the founding team genuinely cares about people, putting that into practice becomes incredibly difficult. What's also incredibly difficult is most of the companies that change the world are like that. They are the rocket ships. When you look at companies like, whether it be what Elon Musk has done with SpaceX or Tesla, or you look at Apple during their initial growth, or even companies like LinkedIn, um, all of which are incredibly successful companies that from a value perspective have created disproportional value on the market compared to other organizations, but definitely struggled with maintaining a culture that is aligned with the values that we are discussing today. And so I think that that's like, how do you reconcile that where you build companies that can change the world, but also can put people first? And I don't know if like there's a way to do it. I think to some extent too, it's like, what are your values, right? Like, do you put this at the top of your values, or are you willing to deal with that stress and the psychological maybe vulnerability and health issues that come with that at that point in your career to gain that experience? I think a lot of it's about transparency too. Like it like in the interview, it's like, if you're on one of those rocket ships, like, hey, my expectations is you're working 60, 70 hours a week. You're not going to have the guidance. I'm not going to be able to invest in X, Y, and Z. I don't think a lot of companies do that. And that's honestly what I feel like is the biggest problem. It's like, what is the expectation set in the interview process? Like, if it's set like, hey, oh, you get this 4-week PTO policy, you get X, Y, and Z benefits, you're going to have support from me every single week. And then you walk into an environment where you're like, maybe you have 4 weeks PTO, but you can't take any of it. You're not getting support.
Right.
Onboarding sucks. It's just an incredibly stressful environment. Then that's really messed up. I mean, that's not what people sign up for. So I think too, it's like, again, it comes down to like the expectation. Like, I totally agree with you. Like, in terms of like from a health perspective, like some of these companies are not the right fit. I just, you would be hopeful that at least some of them are setting a clear expectation that it's not going to be that type of job, right?
Yeah, and I want to backtrack a little to say I don't not love growth. I 100% love it. So Yojo grew its revenue 3x in 2022 from 2021.
That's awesome.
I
Congrats.
Thank you. And I'm always happy to be transparent because I also run a business and I want people to see that I'm not just a wellness expert who is connected to what the employee. I think it's about mirroring and understanding that it needs to be a reciprocal exchange of solving for the employee's pain point as well as the employer.
Yeah.
But what I would say, number one, the rocket ship issue I have is that initially when we saw these tech startups, it was we're working this way as a sprint to get to an IPO. But now people are taking the way that we can work in a sprint and making it go over for years.
Yeah.
Burnout is now recognized by the World Health Organization. And I want to state that those that are pushed to burnout, it can take up to 2, sometimes 5 years to properly repair your nerves. When you are in burnout, you will have cognitive decline, trouble sleeping, trouble with your metabolism, vulnerability to diseases like cancer. So the ask is much greater. Plus, so many people have gone through more in COVID and in this pandemic than they ever have before.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that there's multiple factors. Maybe that 60-hour work week was working before, and I don't mind a 60-hour work week for short increments of time.
Yeah.
But I think that we need to look into the moment we're living in and the future. There's a couple factors. One, more people are burnt out than they ever have been. So the capacity and way they can work to not further harm themselves is a little different. We can still be so productive. We can still get so much done, but the accommodations we need and the way that's communicated are different. And two, Gen Z has entered the workforce. 1 in 4 people in this generation say they will make their career out of being an influencer rather than working in a company. So our expectations for how we can manage the current state of where people are and the new generation coming in the workforce means you've got to adapt if you want the retention, because the people that will put up with a long-term 60-hour work week have declined. There are much less of them out there.
I think what's also just kind of an interesting side point that I thought of is maybe when people think about making that sacrifice to work that much or to work through burnout, maybe they don't realize the cost associated with doing that. I think it may be companies like as a culture, maybe we don't realize when we say, okay, well, this is acceptable as long as we set a proper expectation. Maybe it's because we don't truly understand the health implications.
Right.
Which I hadn't considered before. Like, this is a really interesting conversation to me because like, I know that burnout sucks. Like I've been burnt out several times throughout my career, sometimes pretty bad. And it has impacted productivity at times. I think, there was a point a few years ago, actually before, maybe this was actually 5 years ago. Damn, it's funny how time flies. You're like, oh, this was last year. And then you're like, no,
Yeah.
that was a decade ago. But anyways, like where I hit burnout really, really hard and I didn't realize it, but I was probably working at like 50 to 60% productivity that out of my potential. And I didn't even realize it because it was just like a standard motion. I was so stuck in like this frame of mind, like, oh, I got to grind it out. I got to grind it out. Because that's what you feel like you have to do. And it's also what you're taught, like, particularly in a startup environment, like you're going to sleep under the desk. Like you always hear shit like that. And it's like romanticized as this, like these like amazing days. And they can be, I think, but it's to some extent, but it's not till you step back and you start, like, I didn't take any time off for my first 5 years. And
I feel you. I did that too. And I've also burned, like, we're in the same boat. I think, we learn from the reflections of our own burnout. And the other thing is, when people have that mentality, there's a lot of aspects to it that are also extremely ableist, because those that might have immunodeficiencies or more health vulnerabilities may be the smartest, most genius people that could be the best asset to your workplace.
Yeah.
They could bring the ideas, the customer care, the collaboration, and you'll miss out on getting them because they have vulnerabilities that will not allow them to work at that capacity. And now, when you're missing out on these incredible people and they're missing out on the job opportunities. So again, that's like another little tiny piece of the puzzle, but we've been there, and you and I are healthy people that were able to rebound and be here and push so hard, and not everyone has that capability. And I want to also honor that.
Yeah, for sure. It's again, I'm reflecting on my own personal experience because it's just, I haven't thought about it before, and hopefully this is adding value to, I think just a lot of executives are tuning into this. So I think they're going to have shared experiences to ours. And again, I think slowing down and thinking through this is really, really fascinating. And I think that the reality is too, like regardless if you're a triple digit hyper growth company or not, there are a lot of steps you can take to create a healthier environment. And I think in some environments, it might be more achievable than others, but every company should be focused on optimizing and doing everything that they can to help people live healthy lives, right? I think that that's also the main takeaway. Like, it might be a little harder in a tech startup that's growing, 100% year over year, right? But there's a lot of things that it's not even like on their radar that they need to be focusing on this, or how important this is just from a value perspective, but then also like from an ROI perspective. Like, I think there's a lot left on the table that people could be doing, right?
Oh, totally. And the other thing too is, to move away from the number of hours, right? The other thing is, how can you make the hours people work much more effective? I think that that could be a question that we're asking. So we're like, how can there's this model called ROE, results only work environment. So it really measures, hey, these are the things I need from you. And this is what gets you that paycheck. And then creating the most optimal environment so people can deliver that to you in the easiest way possible. And I think that there's a lot of ways that some companies, I have some clients where I'm just blown away by the emotional intelligence and effectiveness. But there are some ways that we can just make those hours count more. And that's where actually when people feel psychologically safe, they can get 10 times more done in an hour than when they don't. A lot of the people right now that are working those long weeks, it's because 50% of the time they're scrolling on their phone, they're spiraling in their emotions, they're spaced out. So I think the real question is, how do we create an environment so those hours of work are actual work and people feel focused, excited, calm, centered as they're doing their work?
Yeah, that's another very good point. If it's like you constantly feel overwhelmed, you're constantly going to feel like you need to take breaks and you're not going to be as focused and productive. And so I think that that's a really good point. And that's where it's like, you need to have an outcome focused environment, regardless. It's not as important how many hours people work. It's more so, well, it is important. Like you don't want people to work too many hours, but from the perspective of like optimizing, for, this person has to work like X amount of hours. It's like, if it turns out to be a little bit less, that's fine. You don't necessarily want somebody to have 15 or 20 hours work on their plate in most cases, I think, but, maybe you disagree with that, but like, I think it's okay to find a way to get like a reasonable amount of work, but always bent on like, hey, maybe this gets done in less time. You have more time for creative thinking. And I think too, like what's really interesting is I think reflect on my own team. It's like, I have folks on my team that probably work 35 to 40 hours and are crushing it.
Yeah.
Right. And that are just like hyper focused, like, and have a lot going on in their personal life. And just manage everything amazing. I look at them and I'm like, oh my God, like, I don't know how you do it, but, and then I have other people on my team that, work like a lot. And I think too, it's like, it's not that the workload is necessarily, it's just like people also to some extent, I think it's situational leadership. Like
Yeah.
looking at like, what's the psychology of the individual I'm working with, and really being able to not only set clear expectations, but how you interact with those folks needs to vary. Like how, if somebody, for instance, has incredibly high standards for themselves, is typically working more than even I think they should, I'm going to be very careful to provide any type of I have to be very careful with constructive criticism if it's even required, because I know they already hold themselves to such a high standard that I don't want to weigh in on that. And so it's like, chances are they've already thought through 10 different ways they could have handled a situation.
Yeah.
And so it's just more about asking questions, right? And then there's some folks where maybe they need a little bit more direction. They need a little bit more like, opposed to me asking questions, they need me to kind of guide it a little bit more. And I think it's just like understanding your team and their psychology, and then being the leader that they need you to be, opposed to just being one type of leader for everyone, which, you know what I mean? Like, I think that that's pretty important too, right?
I would say, so in terms of creating an environment so that people can work as effectively as possible, and then they can refill their cup and they come to work, excited and with, of course, we're not at our best every day, but what it sounds like to me is that you're an incredible leader. Because what I would say, if I were to give like 4 things that companies could do to prevent their team from being burnt out, to use their time effectively, and to get more done, one of the first ones would be a leadership training, so that leaders can be equipped with those skills of emotional intelligence, of exactly what you said, managing to the person. And it also sounds like you ask a lot of questions, which creates a better talk-listen ratio, so that a leader is actually really creating the environment for the person to share with them. And also, it sounds like you're making accommodations to the personalities of the people that are on your team. All of these things are what excellent leadership looks like. someone who's an amazing individual contributor might not be the best manager if they don't have those mindful tactics of really learning and understanding how to support a person rather than just to be an authority over them. How can you coach them in a way where you understand some people need more boundaries and you've really got to like set those. Other people, like what you're talking about, they're perfectionists and they're really hard on themselves. And so your gentleness will uplift them to take them to the next level. And with good leadership trainings and that emotional intelligence for your leaders, you can create an environment that people are excited. It's that saying, people don't leave jobs, they leave managers. So how do you equip managers so that people really want to stick around?
Yeah, you said that so well. Like I really, this is such an incredible conversation, by the way. I'm really enjoying this. And there's so much content and scripted content that we have not got into, but that's okay because I'm just loving this so much. Like this, by the way, this is going to be, I'm sure, like one of the most popular episodes that we've recorded. So, but anyways, I think like there's two kind of follow-up notes for leaders tuning in that I want to share. One, this really has to come from like a founder, CEO, or a board, is when you're thinking about unit economics and you're thinking about scale and margins, you need to build a profitable or sustainable unit economic ratio in which people can get their job done with a reasonable workload. So what I mean by that is like when I was setting our pricing strategy at Secure Vision, we are a recurring revenue services company. Companies borrow recruiters from us, right? Like we have we have on-demand recruiters, right? That operate like internal recruiters. When I was building out our capacity planning, we made it so we could be profitable based on a recruiter working on 5 to 6 openings at a time.
Yep.
Versus like a lot of agencies where people are working on 15, 20, 30, 40 recs positions at a time. Like we were able to say, okay, and it wasn't only aligned on quality of life for employees so that we could recruit the best people, it was also on delivering the highest level experience for our client.
Yep.
Which a lot of those things, maybe that's another good point. Those things are aligned. When you can attract top talent and allow them to thrive, your customers will thrive too. So that's like point one, is just thinking like when you're thinking unit economics and scale, can you do so in a way that creates great employee experiences that's going to allow you to recruit the best people and provide the best outcomes for your clients? And then the other thing I would say is when you are a leader, you have to learn how to let shit go. Like things are going to get done in a way that maybe isn't the optimal way from your perspective. But that's okay. You have to ask yourself before you give that feedback, ask yourself, like, how much does it really matter? Like, not everything's going to be done the way that I want it to be done, but does this really impact client experience? Or like, is this really going to matter when we're looking at our, hitting our targets? And I think that like one thing that I've learned just throughout leadership is that half the time I want to say something, don't like think like, just shut the up, like
I couldn't agree more.
Right. Like that's something that I've just learned. It's like, I don't want to kill momentum. I don't want somebody to second guess themselves. I hired them to do a job, get out of the way. Right. And I think that that's really hard for some leaders because you have this perfectionist mindset, but you have to let people do it their own way. And you have to be okay if you would have done it differently, as long as it's something that's not like critical to driving business outcomes, let it go. Let it go.
Well, I think the way we run companies is similar to a lot of the conversation that's happening in social justice movements right now. And what it means is that your intention is not nearly as important as your impact. Your impact actually determines the outcome. So a lot of people, and this is where we are really coming into, everyone was getting scared of cancel culture. Everyone was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to say anything. I don't want to be canceled. And I think we've learned to be more nuanced. So now what it is, it's about accountability culture. We are all accountable for all of our actions and our behaviors, and learning to have that emotionally intelligent filter where you say, what is the impact of what I'm about to say? What's the ultimate impact? By asking this person to do these extra things, I may push them over the max and it doesn't actually improve that much for the client. And what I'm saying might be harmful or deteriorate the trust I have with that employee. So the impact I want to have would be best off with me not saying this. And
Right.
that takes honestly a lot of emotional maturity on your end. And that is probably, if I were to say anything for psychological safety, if you want an environment of psychological safety, it means that whoever is in charge of the company needs to have a lot of emotional maturity. And that only comes by doing a lot of work on yourself.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Like so I've made this, I'll be honest, like I have made this mistake one time really bad. But maybe other times I can't think of. I'll just own it. Like, you have to learn somehow. But I think it's, one time I had an employee that was incredibly good and was doing such an amazing job. And I continued to ask them to do more things. I was like, damn, this person's making such an incredible impact. Like, well, maybe he can do this, or maybe he can do that, or he can help with this. And he would. But one thing that I didn't understand is that, again, this is situational leadership. You have to know your people. Some people might step up and say, my capacity is full. But other people are raised in such a way, it's like you don't say no to your boss and you just suck it up and deal with it. And to some extent, it's creating a culture where people feel comfortable providing feedback. But again, it's doing that and also situational leadership.
Right.
And again, like he wasn't the type of person to ever complain or ever say no. And I'm not saying no is complaining; those are two separate
Right.
things. But like he was just like, his mindset is like, if I say no, that is complaining. Is a better way of saying what I just said. Like that was his psychology. Had nothing to do with how I was treating him or anything like that. I was just tone deaf to his own psychology being different from mine, and then just assuming that he was thinking about it the same way I would. Like, well, he's an experienced person. He has over 10 years of experience. If he has too much on his plate, he's going to let me know. Not the case. He burnt out, left the company. I offered saying like, hey, I'll give you a month off, fully paid. You come back, we'll cut your workload in half. It was done. He wasn't interested. And so that was a really important lesson for me. And that's why I'm sharing it here, because hopefully that's valuable for people tuning in so they can learn from that.
Yeah. And you know what? Thank you so much for that vulnerable share, because it really, I really want to end by saying, if any of you listen and you think, oh my God, I made all these mistakes, I'm a horrible leader, what's wrong with me? You're not. That the beauty of accountability culture is that to err is human. The thing we all have in common is that in our lives we will be harmed and we will harm. And we are in this wonderful pivot as work is evolving, where we get this opportunity to just keep learning and keep growing and taking these pieces and finding ways to add this human aspect to work, and understanding the humanity within the company actually will lead to your bottom line and the quality of the lives of everyone involved. If you make a mistake, it's okay. I think most people do not deserve to be canceled. They deserve the opportunity to be better and grow and change, and to, make emotional intelligence, which is what it sounds, from your leadership, the situational leadership, the understanding, how to change for the future. All of that, I'm sure you never made that mistake again, and it led you to grow even more. I've done so many things. If I could go back in time, in hindsight, it's so obvious how I would treat the people I've managed differently. I've made so many errors, but it's that desire to be better and to lead from a place of humanity that I think we're going to see a lot of growth from the companies that do that in this coming year.
I totally agree. And just so I know, do you have a hard stop at
No, I
11
don't.
Eastern?
I didn't put
Okay.
anything there. I had a feeling this would be juicy, but I didn't think it would be like, I feel like we've been able to play off of everything the other person said, just like ping pong. It's been
Right.
so fun. And honestly, your leadership examples keep embodying, like even what you were saying about what you said about that employee, you thought, oh, someone would say no. It reminded me of the example of the 4 stress responses. And I teach this as a workshop for managers to be able to have a more emotionally intelligent lens to their employees. So what you described is the fawn response. A lot of us are actually operating out of fear because of, unprocessed, unhealed issues that we have. Eileen Fisher has an amazing quote where she said, 80% of what we bring into our job is our unhealed childhood wounds. So a person who is such a pleaser, they're terrified to say no. that is someone operating from a fawn response.
Mm.
And companies love them because they're your yes person. They're easy to get along with. They'll do anything you tell them. But the unfortunate part is they'll burn the candle at both ends. And when they hit that end point, they're likely to just be shut down. They could be resentful, and you won't keep them.
Yeah.
So the way we can understand if someone's operating from fight, flight, fear, or fawn, you don't have to be a clinical psychologist to figure it out. You just have to be amazing at asking people questions. Ask them questions. How do you like to be managed? Do you need a lot of structure? Are you really good at structuring yourself? And write it down, have it in writing so you have this agreement together. Hey, I agree to manage you this way because this is what works for you. And if they don't honor that, if they're not productive within the confines you've given them, you can revisit that. But I think that it's not like you don't have to be a clinical psychologist. You don't have to be Sherlock Holmes. You just have to be great at asking questions and giving people the space to talk. And they will, when they feel safe and comfortable with you, they will say a lot.
Yeah, that's very well said. Very well said, because I think it's just psychologically too, when you ask questions, you're showing that you care, one. And I think when you show that you care, people are going to start to feel a little bit more heard when they have an opportunity to express themselves. And as long as you honor that and you respect that and you don't shut it down, it starts to build a lot more trust where people are a lot more willing to come back. I mean, I think this also holds true for employee surveys, or, you know, and we always recommend, like, yes, employee surveys are good, but also you need those one-on-one conversations consistently. But one thing, whenever we put out any type of survey or we're asking questions one-on-one, as a leadership team, we have to remind ourselves, like, we better implement something. Like, we need to commit now before we even know what they're going to say. We got to implement at least some of this stuff, because if we don't implement any of this feedback, they're going to stop giving it. And I think that that's really important to note too. That doesn't mean, like, now sometimes people aren't going to understand the implications, like downstream implications of a decision. So they might say, hey, why don't we do things this way? And we can't do it that way because on an individual level, that might work well for you, but at scale, that's not sustainable, or the unit economics don't end up working out, or, you know, there's things that they may not understand, but there are a lot of things, that suggestions that they have, that you need to, if you can do it, do it. Like, don't even start to question, like, well, what do I think? It's like, if you can do it, do it. If the team wants it, just get it done. Because, you know, it creates that environment of safety where they come back to you. They're more likely to question you because you don't want a yes person, right? Like, you want somebody that's going to be a valuable sounding board for your ideas, and people have different perspectives based on where they are in the company. So you want that constructive criticism to come back to the top. And if you don't implement their ideas, they're going to stop coming to you. Right.
I couldn't agree more with you. I think that what it also, in life, our stress responses come up the most when we feel very out of control. And when we feel a sense of self-efficacy, when we feel a sense of empowerment and autonomy, we tend to feel safer and better. So when you talk to someone and your ideas matter, and you feel like you have some control in your work environment, or you can get the accommodations that you need as a person to work effectively, it changes the game completely. You've now created an empowered employee who feels confident and will operate from their best self. And I want to say one other thing too, because I feel it would be really negligent not to talk about the diversity, equity, and inclusion aspect. The understanding of unconscious bias, the understanding of our own set of privileges, our own body of experiences, and how that is interacting in every workspace is really powerful. That is a way that we can make people feel seen and feel safe. Really understanding what are all the privileges and what are all the marginalizations that come with my identity, and am I creating an environment that is supportive of the other people there? This takes a lot of training. So if anyone is not watching the video of this, I will give a description of my own identity. I am a cis white woman. I am also a queer person, and I'm an able-bodied person. everywhere I go, every part of my identity comes with me. And there are parts of that that will make someone feel safer. There are parts of that will make them not feel safer, depending on how I interact with them. So, and I want to break that down because I think that diversity, equity, and inclusion gets really, really confusing. So for instance, I like to create an environment where someone truly knows that I will respect them, that I am doing all the work I can to remove unconscious bias, and be okay apologizing because I'll mess things up. I've accidentally used a wrong pronoun with someone before and then said, oh, I'm so sorry. You know, maybe I said she, her, and then I go, I'm so sorry. And then I correct myself and I say they, them. It's also, that's a really overt one. For example of how I've had this, I've been in a position where a male boss of mine pulled me aside because I wasn't smiling enough on a meeting and was like, I noticed you weren't smiling. Are you okay? None of my male colleagues got treated that way. So when we take out our unconscious bias, we become aware of our identity and others, we do create an environment that will less put someone in a fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And I would like to, before we jump off, could we dive into some more, I don't know if examples, but when we get into unconscious biases and we get into microaggressions and boundaries of communication, can you riff on that a little bit more to maybe help educate leaders on some common mistakes and things that maybe they're not aware of, but are really potentially hurting their team?
Oh, absolutely. So this is like one of my favorite topics. I think the most important part, again, it begins from the mindful management. So this comes into really understanding what are all the aspects of my own identity, because I am always bringing myself into every conversation that I'm in. And one of the things that gets in our way of looking at that, I find people get really, really defensive, is guilt, fear, or shame. So one example, again, with the pronouns, I had someone on my team at the last place that I was working who was a gender nonconforming person who went by they, them pronouns. My job as a manager is ensure that the people on my team are safe. I had 3 different conversations with 3 different people that misgendered this person. And in each of the conversations, I paused the conversation to say, hey, I just wanted to let you know that so-and-so actually goes by they, them, not she, her. That's all I said, nothing loaded. One of the people stopped and said, I am so sorry. I'm going to make sure to change that next time. Thank you for letting me know. The other 2 got really defensive. So what I would say is, in diversity, equity, inclusion, be prepared to potentially, if it's new to you, feel guilt, to feel defensive, and be comfortable sitting with that. Keep learning, keep educating yourself. There's a wonderful book. I have it on my shelf, actually. It's called Subtle Acts of Exclusion. There's a lot of education. If you have not already, ensure that you are taking time to work with a professional to learn all the ways that you can take unconscious bias down, and to understand that any issue, any marginalization you don't have, it's easy to overlook or say it's not happening just because you've never had to think about it. For instance, there may be a disability. You may not know if there's a disability ramp or a way for a wheelchair to get into the building you're currently in if you're not in a wheelchair. We don't know or think about the things we don't have to. And so the more we can learn about identities outside of our own, the more we can learn how to make others feel safe and comfortable and ensure that our language is inclusive.
Sure. And I think particularly with DE&I, it's important to, it's always a great time to start focusing on it. I think ideally, if companies can do it at the beginning of their journey when they're smaller, it's a lot easier than trying to change a culture of 1,000 people or 2,000 or 5,000 people. So it's, if you could start when you're under 50 employees and maybe you don't have an opportunity to get somebody in full time, or you don't necessarily have an HR leader yet, that is an expert on the topic. At a minimum, being able to bring in an expert on a consulting basis to help put together the playbooks and do educational trainings for the company, and particularly the leadership team. There's so much that can be done at an earlier stage that is ultimately in the long run going to benefit the company. It's going to create a much better culture. The ROI we discussed as well.
Yeah.
And the other ROI too is being able to attract great people. And as we, continue to see evolution of values in the workforce, right? And younger people coming up, like, you have to be aligned with their value system in order to make sure that you're able to attract and retain the best folks, and be able to enable them in an environment where they feel like their needs are being met, and that as a result, they're going to be able to do their best work. So it's nice in life when values can align with the outcomes you need to produce
Yeah,
professionally. And
absolutely.
this is definitely, there's such strong alignment here. It's hard to this is good. This is good stuff. Like, this is something that needs to be a priority. And I think, just again, it's not that companies don't want to. I just don't think that they're educated enough in understanding truly what psychological safety is, and how important it is, and how getting it right can help them, and how getting it wrong is devastating. I just think that there's just a lack of awareness and education overall.
Exactly. And I think that, again, I love everything that you said, because it's when I think about the topic, it's so overwhelming. I'm like, how could I talk about this for 5 minutes on a podcast? But it really is, there are so many steps. It's not a helpless situation. In fact, it's a situation where there's so much optimism and opportunity, where we can really let people be their best. And we can create an environment where more people succeed, because we take away these barriers to entry that have existed they've existed in a much worse way from the start of the creation of, people coming to America from Europe. So, America was kind of founded on situations of inequity, and this is an incredible opportunity to change that.
Absolutely. So Jessa, this has been a very interesting, insightful conversation. I think that there's a lot of value here for executives as well as anyone tuning in. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your expertise, and essentially giving us a masterclass on this topic. I really appreciate your contribution today.
Oh, thank you so much. It was really such a fun start to my day. I'm really pumped, and I had the best time with you today. Thank you so much for having me.
This was great. And Jessa, what's the best way that people can engage with you and your company if they want to learn more about you and what you do?
Absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn, Jessa Messina, JESSA MESSINA, or you can check out my website, yojo.co. And yeah, follow me, shoot me a message. I'd love to talk more to you.
Okay, great. And also, on your website, are there, like, if people want to do additional reading, are there resources on your site, or do you have any recommendations? Like, I know you mentioned a book. I just, like, if people want to learn more, where should they go about just the
Absolutely.
topic?
So I am going to have a more filled out page where I'm going to include all of my favorite resources that I go to, as well as resources that I've created, free webinars. But if you click the resource link on my current website, you'll see plenty there. And in the coming months, there'll be even more for you.
Love it. Love it. Well, thank you, Jessa. And for everybody tuning in, thank you so much. This has been a blast, and make sure to check out talenttrends.io. You can find all of our shows as well as the transcripts. And if you know anybody that would be a great guest, or if you would like to be a guest, there's also an opportunity to apply for the show there. So anyways, thanks for joining us, and we will see you next time.